Yakov Mozarov wipes foundry dust from his eyes with a forearm already black to the elbow. It is September 3rd, 1942. The Ural machinery plant in Nizhny Tagil has not been quiet in 11 months. The furnaces never cool. The men never sleep more than 4 hours. And somewhere outside, 700 kilometers to the southwest, the city of Stalingrad is being eaten alive, street by street, floor by floor, room by room. Yakov is 23 years old. He is not a soldier, he is a molder. And what he does tonight with a wooden frame, river clay, and a pattern made from sheet steel will matter more to this war than any rifle. He packs the clay by hand, not gently. He drives it in with his fists because the mold has to hold against liquid steel at 1600 degrees. The smell is iron and char and wet earth and sweat. The noise is everything at once. Hammers, cranes, the liquid roar of a tapped furnace pouring metal that glows like a second sun. A casting defect tonight means a turret fails in the field. A turret that fails in the field means a crew of 4 dies inside it. Yakov knows this. Every man on this floor knows this. They do not speak about it. They just pack the clay harder. What he is making is the turret of a T-34, the most important weapon the Soviet Union possesses. And the Soviets are running out of them faster than they can build them. By the summer of 1942, the arithmetic of the Eastern Front was genocide written in steel. The Wehrmacht had destroyed or captured more than 20,000 Soviet tanks since June 1941. 20,000. The Red Army had started the war with the largest armored force in human history, and Germany had shredded it in 13 months. Not because Soviet tanks were universally inferior, the T-34 shocked German crews when they first encountered it, but because Soviet production, logistics, and tactical doctrine had collapsed simultaneously under the weight of Barbarossa. The Kharkov tractor plant was gone, the Leningrad factory was under siege, the Stalingrad tractor plant was producing tanks while shells landed on the factory roof, and workers carried rifles to their stations between shifts. The Soviet industrial base had been physically picked up and thrown east of the Urals, and the machines were still being bolted to their new floors while the front screamed for armor. Germany understood the race it was in. By 1942, Krupp and MAN were refining the Panzer IV and accelerating the Panther program. German turrets were sandcast or machined, produced in established factories with skilled toolmakers, quality control processes, and a workforce that had not been displaced across a continent in 6 months. A German turret casting was a precise thing: controlled wall thickness, carefully managed alloy ratios, consistent hardness across the face. The Soviet Union, stripped of its Western industrial capacity and bleeding men at a rate no nation had ever survived, could not match that process. Not as it stood. Something had to change. The man most responsible for changing it was not a general. He was not a commissar. He was a metallurgical engineer named Isaac Zaltzman, and he ran the Kirov plant, first in Leningrad, then, after the evacuation, in Chelyabinsk, a city that would earn a name that still carries weight today. They called it Tankograd, Tank City. Zaltzman was 40 years old, relentless, technically brilliant, and operating under conditions that would have destroyed a lesser mind. Stalin had made clear what failure meant. Zaltzman did not intend to fail. The problem he faced was specific and brutal. Precision sandcasting of T-34 turrets required dry, graded, chemically bonded sand mixtures, materials that needed controlled preparation, specialist equipment, and time. Time was exactly what Tankograd did not have. The plant was receiving 15,000 workers evacuated from Leningrad and Kharkov simultaneously. Many arrived without their machine tools, which were still in transit on rail lines being bombed. Some arrived without adequate clothing in a Ural winter that killed men who stood still for too long. Zaltzman's engineers looked at what they had: river clay, coarse aggregate, water, wood for patterns, and human hands by the thousands. The solution they developed was a process already used in small-scale Soviet foundry work, but never attempted at this scale or speed. They would use natural clay-bonded green sand molds, what Western foundry men called green sand, because the molds were used wet, uncured, still damp when the steel was poured. But the Soviet adaptation went further. In many cases, where even graded sand was short, they used raw river clay mixed with the coarsest local aggregate they could find, packed by hand directly against a wooden or steel pattern and used immediately. The molds were expendable. They were destroyed by every pore. It did not matter because clay was free and the rivers of the Urals ran full. What mattered was the metal that came out. If stories like this one are new to you, subscribing takes 3 seconds and means you will never miss one like it. The clay green sand process had genuine metallurgical drawbacks, and Salzmann's engineers knew every one of them. A wet mold generates steam when hot metal contacts it. Steam means gas porosity. Tiny bubbles trapped inside the casting that create weak points. The surface finish was rough, visibly rough, with a texture like coarse sandpaper, where a German machine turret was almost smooth. Wall thickness varied more than it should have. But the Soviet engineers made a series of deliberate decisions that turned these weaknesses into something acceptable. They increased the nominal wall thickness of the turret to compensate for variation. If the average wall was thicker than needed, the weak spots were still strong enough. They accepted a rougher exterior surface because exterior surface finish has no effect on ballistic performance. And for the gas porosity, they adjusted the carbon and manganese content of the steel alloy to produce a slightly tougher, more ductile matrix that could tolerate small internal voids without catastrophic failure. The turret that came out was not pretty. It worked. The wooden patterns and the forms packed into the clay to create the void the steel would fill were made by carpenters, not precision machinists. A team of 3 men could produce a new pattern in hours. When a pattern wore out or was damaged, it was replaced that same shift. The mold boxes themselves were rough timber frames knocked together on site. The entire tooling cost for one turret mold was measured in rubles small enough to be absurd. And because there was no curing time, no drying oven, no chemical binder waiting to set, a mold could go from raw clay to poured steel in under 2 hours. At Tankograd and at the Ural machinery plant in Nizhny Tagil and at the Ural plant nearby, this process ran day and night, every day, without stopping. The production figures that resulted still seem wrong when you first read them. In 1942, Soviet factories produced 24,446 tanks. Germany produced 9,300. In 1943, the Soviet Union produced 35,667 armored fighting vehicles. Germany produced 19,800. By 1944, the ratio was approaching 2-to-1 in Soviet favor, and in certain categories of medium tank, it was worse than that for Germany. The crude clay molds were not the only reason. American Lend-Lease supplies, Soviet labor mobilization, and the sheer territorial depth of the Ural industrial base all contributed. But the decision to cast 50,000 turrets in cheap destructible clay molds rather than wait for precision tooling that did not exist was the hinge on which the production miracle turned. Without that decision made in late 1941 and early 1942, the numbers do not work. The front does not hold. The war ends differently. The T-34 turrets cast by this method were not identical to the pre-war Kharkov product. Veterans who handled both could tell the difference. The rough hexagonal castings of the early Ural production, sometimes called the hard-edge turrets by German intelligence analysts studying captured vehicles, bore the fingerprints of the clay process literally on their surface. German tankers who knocked one out and climbed inside reported the interior finish as crude by any industrial standard, but the armor hardness tested at acceptable levels. The ballistic performance against German anti-tank rounds of 1942 and early 1943 was within specification. A T-34 with a clay-cast turret and a terrified 20-year-old crew could still kill a Panzer IV at 400 meters. That was all it needed to do. German intelligence tracked Soviet production numbers and periodically refused to believe them. A December 1941 assessment by the Wehrmacht's Fremde Heere Ost, Foreign Armies East, the intelligence branch covering the Soviet Union, estimated Soviet tank production capacity at somewhere between 600 and 900 vehicles per month. The actual figure by mid-1942 was already over 2,000 per month and rising. The Germans were not incompetent analysts. They simply could not conceive of a production process so deliberately stripped of precision that it could operate inside a half-built factory with no specialist equipment and a workforce learning the job in real time. The clay mold process was invisible to German industrial intelligence because it did not look like a production process. It looked like improvisation. It was both. Panther turrets, by comparison, required precision sand casting with chemically bonded synthetic sand, oven curing, and subsequent machining of all mating surfaces. A single Panther turret took weeks from pattern to finished casting. The production bottleneck was so severe that in the weeks before Kursk in the summer of 1943, completed Panther hulls sat at Grafenwöhr, waiting for turrets that had not yet arrived from the Nuremberg factories. The Soviets at Kursk fielded roughly 3,600 tanks. Germany fielded around 2,900, and a significant portion of those, the new Panthers, suffered catastrophic mechanical failures in the first days because the design had been rushed. The T-34s that broke the German offensive at Prokhorovka on July 12, 1943, were largely armed with turrets made in clay molds by men like Yakov Mozarov. They were crude. They were enough. Museums in Russia preserve examples of the wartime production T-34 that show the clay casting marks clearly, the rough exterior surfaces, the slightly irregular geometry of early Ural production turrets that differs visibly from the cleaner lines of post-war Soviet armor. The Central Museum of the Great Patriotic War in Moscow holds several. The Kubinka Tank Museum outside Moscow has a collection that lets you stand beside a 1942 Ural production T-34 and see exactly what the process produced. A machine that looks unfinished by German standards and was used to finish Germany. Historians debate the precise contribution of each factor in Soviet victory on the Eastern Front. They do not debate that production won it, and production, in the desperate winter of 1941 and through the catastrophe of 1942, was bought with clay. Yakov Mozarov packs the last of the clay into the mold frame. He lifts it onto the line. In 4 hours, liquid steel at 1600 degrees will fill the void his hands have shaped, and it will cool into something that will be bolted onto a hull, loaded onto a train, and driven into a battle he will never see. He does not know if this particular turret will matter. He does not know if the crew who receives it will live or die inside it. He knows the shift ends in 3 hours, he will sleep for 4, and then he will be back here, packing clay again, because the front does not pause and the furnaces do not cool, and the war is not waiting for precision. 50,000 turrets, made in mud, shipped east to west as Germany bled dry, waiting for perfect metal that arrived too slowly, in too few numbers, with too many parts that had not yet cleared the factory floor. Germany built a better turret. The Soviet Union built more. In a war of that scale and that duration, more is the only word that matters. More is the word that ends empires. More is the word carved into the outcome of the Eastern Front in letters made of clay, fire, and the hands of men who never stopped.